In 1766, Joseph Haydn composed a theme and variations for piano forehands called Il Maestro e lo Scolare. In it, the Maestro teaches the Scolare how to compose a theme. The Maestro plays the first two bars, a melody outlining scale degrees 1, 2, and 3 over a 1-7-1 bass, ending on the dominant, followed by the Scolare imitating what the teacher plays note for note. The Maestro then plays one bar containing scale degrees 6 and 5 in the bass, set to parallel sixths counterpoint, with scale degrees 4 and 3 in the melody, offset by a syncopation that creates a 7/6 suspension on beat 2. The Scolare dutifully repeats. The Maestro then inverts the pattern from parallel sixths to parallel tenths, using scale degrees 4 and 3 in the bass, with scale degrees 6 and 5 now in the melody. The Scolare echoes this as well, and then both play simultaneously to end the phrase with a perfect authentic cadence in the tonic. Despite the obvious humor in this piece, the Scolare has learned many important aspects of composition. How to create an opening gesture as a main theme, how to answer the opening with an idiomatic continuation, and how to flesh out basic counterpoint with embellishing tones called diminutions, use invertible counterpoint, and create a rich polyphonic texture featuring suspensions. Haydn's choice of Italian for the title of this work is significant. By the middle of the 18th century, Italian maestros, particularly from Naples, dominated music pedagogy throughout Europe. Their method of teaching, called Partimento, was like a hands-on workshop in composition, dealing with the kinds of ideas presented in Haydn's charming tune. Haydn's portrayal represents a scene in which many young musicians across Europe would have participated with their Italian maestros. Indeed, there may be an element of autobiography in this piece, as Haydn spent a period of 3 years between 1753 and 1755 as an apprentice to the Neapolitan opera composer and renowned vocal teacher Nicola Porpora. During this period, Haydn spent his time as a personal valet to Porpora and served as his accompanist during voice lessons. Haydn on multiple occasions credits his time with Porpora as critical to his development as a composer. In a well-known autobiographical sketch written in 1776, Haydn writes, "I wrote diligently but not in a well-founded way, until finally I had the good fortune to learn the true fundamentals of composition from the celebrated Herr Porpora, who was at that time in Vienna." Towards the end of his life, Haydn also reports to his biographer Griesinger, "There was no lack of assino, coglione, birbante, and pokes in the ribs, but I put up with it all, for I profited greatly with Porpora in singing, in composition, and in the Italian language." Haydn's statement, "true fundamentals," is tantalizing, yet lacking in specifics, which has led to speculation as to what he may have meant. Various authors have focused on Italian vocal technique and text setting with limited results. More recently, however, Felix Diergarten has pointed to a resurgence in both the study of Italian Partimento pedagogy, and here I'm particularly thinking of scholars like Giorgio Sanguinetti, Peter Van Toor, and Ewald de Mereyre, and Robert Yerdigan's schema theory, as a way to perhaps shed light on Haydn's true fundamentals comment. Porpora was a disciple of Partimento teacher Gaetano Greco in Naples, and himself became a teacher at the Neapolitan Conservatory of San Onofrio. While no smoking gun exists showing that Haydn studied directly from Partimento manuscripts under Porpora, circumstantial evidence abounds. As a Neapolitan-trained maestro, Porpora would have been teaching from solfeggi and Partimento, two sides of the same pedagogical coin, and Haydn most certainly would have been exposed to the methods therein. Furthermore, Haydn's music from this period shows a clear influence of the Italian style, especially opera, Italy's chief export and a product of its pedagogy. In spite of these obvious connections, relatively little attention has been paid to link Partimento practice to Haydn's music. In this paper, I will examine Haydn's instrumental works from the 1750s in order to demonstrate the ways in which Partimento may have influenced his music. Part 1. Defining Partimento. Advancements in the study of Italian music pedagogy in recent years have shed light on the practice of Partimento and solfeggi. The practice, developed towards the end of the 17th century and which continued into the 20th, was remarkably consistent in its methodology. Students would begin by learning the rules, which consist of intervals, move on to cadence types, the rule of the octave, a kind of shorthand guide for harmonizing each tone of the scale of a key, and other options for setting voices to various sequential bass motions called moti del basso. From there, students would graduate to realizing bass lines designed to emphasize one or more of the rules. The melodic content that would pair with the bass lines was covered in solfeggi, which uses a hexachordal mutating type of solfege from ut to la. These bass lines would range from the simple to the highly complex, at their more difficult stages resembling something between a thorough bass exercise and an actual composition. These late-stage exercises culminate in the composition of four-voice fugues. By true fundamentals, it is plausible that Haydn was referring to this methodology. Every maestro had their own set of rules, partimenti, and solfeggi, which were either taken from their teachers, borrowed from colleagues, or personally adapted based on the same guiding principles. Here are the rules of Fedele Fenaroli, who was appointed maestro at the Neapolitan Conservatory of Santa Maria de Loreto in 1762. These rules are published in Book 3 of a 5-book graduated course leading from simple figured basses to more difficult unfigured basses and, ultimately, fugue. After a presentation of the intervals, Fenaroli discusses the 3 cadence types of partimento. The cadenza semplice, or simple cadence, consists of a 5/3 chord above the bass on scale degree 5, moving directly to a 5/3 above the bass on scale degree 1. The next cadence, the cadenza composta, or compound cadence, contains the same bass motion from 5 to 1, embellished with a 4/3 suspension, or alternatively a 6/4 suspension, moving to a 5/3. Finally, the cadenza doppia, double cadence, is a 4-stage process. It begins on scale degree 5 in the bass with a 5/3 chord that moves to a 6/4, brings back the 5 but holds the 4 as a suspension, then resolves the 4 to 3 before ending on the tonic. After learning cadences, the student would progress to the rule of the octave in all 3 positions, starting with scale degree 1 in the soprano, then with scale degree 3, and then scale degree 5. Here's Fenaroli's rule of the octave in the first position, which maintains a smooth, stepwise voice leading around scale degree 1 in the soprano. This version of the harmonized scale would remain in the student's mind as an ideal paradigm containing all the possible voices that could be matched to a particular scale degree in the bass in any key. Oftentimes, the partimento would be realized with 1 or 2 voices above the bass, with the fully harmonized scale providing a theoretical guide with respect to which appropriate intervals could be used at any given time. Fenaroli's first exercise is simple, as it deals only with cadences and the rule of the octave. This partimento highlights the 3 cadence types in the rule of the octave as expressed in the tonic G major and the dominant D major. There's a simple cadence across the bar line in measures 1 and 2. Later on, after modulating to D major, there is a compound cadence in that key in measures 9 and 10. Finally, after returning to the tonic G major, at the end of the partimento, there is a double cadence in measures 15 and 16. Each cadence type is therefore represented in the 3 cadences that occur in this exercise. In between these cadences are various permutations of the rule of the octave in both G and D major. Measures 2 and 3 are an ascending and descending scale in the tonic, while measures 4 and 5 are an exact transposition of this scalar pattern in the dominant. Measures 12 through 14 are a complete ascending scale and the tonic, which upon completion moves directly into the concluding cadenza doppia. The Partimento student would have to recognize these patterns and realize them correctly according to the above discussed rules, at the risk of being poked in the ribs by the Maestro. Finally, the moti del basso presents sequential bass lines that require treatment outside the scope of the rule of the octave. These settings involve various combinations of 6/3 and 5/3 chords, often making use of suspensions. Here, Fenaroli presents solutions to a rising bass line by step, treated as a chain of 5/6 suspensions. Another version of this features 7/6 suspensions generated by a leap to the octave above the bass on the end of each measure. Nicola Porpora was from the generation of partimentisti before Fenaroli and was a student of the prior generation's Gaetano Greco at the Conservatory Poveri di Gesù Cristo in Naples. He would go on to a successful career as an opera composer, then becoming a maestro himself at San Onofrio from 1715 to 1722, where he famously trained the castrato Farinelli, among several others. He went on to leave this post, according to Sanguinetti, most likely because of the low salary and relative instability of these demanding positions. He taught nobility in various cities across Europe before coming to Vienna, where he stayed with the poet Metastasio from 1753 to 1759. It was at this time that Porpora met Haydn, who was living in an upstairs apartment above Metastasio, and who was giving the young Mariana von Martinez lessons in music theory. Porpora likely gave Martinez singing lessons, and she went on to become a successful composer and singer, often performing in her own operas and cantatas. Haydn served as Porpora's accompanist where, as the early Haydn biographer Giuseppe Carpani writes, Haydn learned from Porpora the true Italian style of singing and the art of accompanying at the harpsichord, an exercise much more delicate than is commonly supposed. He frequently had to accompany Porpora's difficult compositions, full of learned modulations and basses difficult to work out. He laid the foundations for the theory of modulation and chords there. Haydn would have accompanied Porpora's lessons in singing from solfeggi like this, where he would have been thrown into the fire, so to speak, of realizing the bass line at the harpsichord, while Porpora's students sang above it. In this solfeggio in C major, we see evidence of an implied rule of the octave in measures 1 and 2, followed by a move to the relative minor, A minor, at the end of measure 2. Measures 2 and 3 both begin with 4/3 suspensions over G major and A minor, respectively. In measures 5 and 6, there are a chain of 5/6 suspensions over a rising bass. In measures 9 and 10, there is a bass motion of a falling third and a rising fourth, which would have been harmonized with a series of 5/3 chords. Note also the chromatic wedge in measures 11 and 12, a common bass motion in the minor mode. The section in A minor concludes with a compound cadence in measures 13 and 14. Porpora offered elite-level training in this method, and his reputation demanded a level of excellence from his students. As accompanist, Haydn may very well have read from this solfeggio, and he must have worked tirelessly to master all the patterns necessary to accompany these singing lessons. Of note also are the variety of textures in the vocal part, a sign of the Italian bel canto style of singing, which features idiomatic runs using 16th note triplets, dotted 16th 32nd note rhythms, and a variety of other polyphonic melodies to match the implied harmony of each beat. Let us hear how this sounds. addition to Porpora's solfeggi, there are also extant manuscripts of Porpora Partimenti, from which we may see the process of creating imitative fughetti out of these exercises. Peter Van Toor has recently demonstrated that these partimenti contain exercises not all by Porpora, but rather by Leonardo Leo. Nevertheless, there are authentic Porpora partimenti in this collection, and the basic concept remains the same across the exercises of all the maestros. In demonstrating this concept, Robert Yerrigan and Giorgio Sanguinetti have described a process in these advanced partimenti whereby the student would have to solve a kind of musical puzzle presented in the bass line. Certain parts of a partimento are more active or interesting, rhythmically and motivically, whereas others, by contrast, are rather slow-moving and unadorned or boring. Students would be expected to identify these moments as opportunities demanding contrapuntal treatment of the interesting part, which would be thematic in a fugal texture. In this partimento excerpt, the opening two measures are rather boring when compared to the more characteristic idea in measure 5, where something akin to a theme appears. The appearance of the tenor clef, incidentally, can often be indicative of an entrance of a voice on the theme, and thus the need to combine the two parts. Sure enough, when one interpolates this theme beginning at the end of measure 5 onto measures 1 and 2, it fits over the slow-moving or boring bass line. Conversely, when one places the boring bass line in the soprano in measures 5 and 6, it similarly works, creating the kind of invertible counterpoint necessary to conceive a fugal subject. Here's my rather clumsy realization. I'm sure better solutions can be worked out, but this will do to illustrate the point. This fugal excerpt represents the culmination of Partimento pedagogy, by which point students would have mastered the rules and were prepared to compose for any musical context, sacred or secular, and for any ensemble type. It is by this method that scores of Italian composers went on to successful careers as opera and church composers, as well as became influential pedagogues to the biggest names in music across Europe for the better part of 2 centuries. Part 2. From Partimenti to Pieces. Perhaps the clearest way to get from an exercise in Partimento to a piece of music is through diminution, or the filling in of Partimento counterpoint with polyphonic melodies of faster note values and a variety of surface rhythms. This is perhaps the biggest missing link, so to speak, between theory and practice, because the maestros relied heavily on oral instruction for this aspect of their pedagogy. The best clues we have are found in solfeggi, like the one we previously saw by Porpora, and in the rare written-out Partimento completion by a student, of which only a few precious examples are extant. Only Francesco Durante, a classmate of Porpora's at the Poveri di Gesù Cristo, recorded snippets of possible realizations of particular bass patterns found in his Partimenti. Durante was an exact contemporary of Porpora, living from 1684 to 1755, and, like Porpora, was a student of Greco. This strong link between Durante and Porpora suggests that the two maestros would have had similar approaches to diminution, and so Durante's style would have been a close approximation to any hypothetical verbal instruction Haydn would have received from Porpora. Durante's diminutions present various options for setting specific bass progressions. These options are neither exhaustive nor binding, but rather provide guidelines to realization. Durante's first Partimento demonstrates a variety of approaches to setting a motion from scale degree 7 in the bass to scale degree 1. The polyphonic melodies in these options tend to outline a dominant 7th chord by scalar motion or arpeggiation, resulting in a prominent resolution from scale degree 4 to scale degree 3 in the soprano. Here's what this sounds like. The fourth movement of Haydn's Sonata in G major, Hoboken 16 No. 6, likely composed before 1760, outlines a similar voice-leading device. This sonata is one of 9 listed in the Henley Urtext edition as little early sonatas, possibly of the kind that Haydn composed for his students while teaching in the 1750s. As such, this sonata, and all the other Haydn keyboard sonatas presented here today, may have been written while Haydn was in the midst of his studies with Porpora. Coming off of a half cadence in the original tonic, the music continues in the key of the dominant D major. Now in D, we see an alternation of scale degrees 1 and 7 in the bass, featuring the 4-3 resolution in the soprano, first in measures 12 and 13, then repeated in measures 14 and 15. Durante then shows how this 7-1 motion in the bass with 4-3 soprano resolution can set a composer up to lead directly into a compound cadence for the end of a phrase. These will play back to back, and please excuse the awkward waiting for the whole notes to finish between examples. Haydn's Sonata in C, Hoboken 16, number 10, follows exactly this pattern. Occurring at the very end of the exposition, a cadence in the second key occurs with a unison in both parts in measure 15, followed by 4 varied iterations of the 7-1 bass with the 4-3 soprano. Landing on scale degree 3 at the end of each of these patterns ultimately allows Haydn to finish off the section with a melodic line consisting of scale degrees 4, 3, 2, and 1 over the compound cadence. In Durante's 10th example, we see another way to set a bass that alternates between scale degrees 1 and 7 in the bass. The first option begins on scale degree 1 in the soprano, then oscillates between scale degrees 2 and 3, creating a parallel thirds counterpoint. While this is going on, there is a constant interpolation of scale degree 5 on the offbeats, decorated by an upper neighbor figure. This offbeat scale degree 5 is one of the defining features of this particular style of realization. The second option similarly sets scale degrees 2 and 3 in the soprano in parallel thirds against 1 and 7 in the bass, this time with the interpolation of scale degree 5 occurring in the lower part. In Haydn's keyboard sonata in D major, Hoboken 16, number 4, we see very similar, though not exact, style in the part writing. Again, Haydn was studying with Porpora, not Durante, and so Haydn's texture may have been one of Porpora's own modifications of this pattern. The end of the opening theme in this sonata exposition contains a passage that uses scale degrees 1, 2, and 3 in the bass against 3, 4, and 5 in the soprano. Characteristic of this style of realization, the parallel thirds counterpoint is decorated with an interpolated scale degree 5 on the offbeats of the lower part. This progression leads directly into a simple cadence with a sped-up harmonic rhythm marking the conclusion of the opening theme. Immediately following the opening theme, the music then moves into a series of arpeggios that initiate a modulation to the dominant A major. Upon establishing this new key in measure 10, Haydn moves into a similar texture of parallel thirds in the outer voices. Now in A major, the bass ascends stepwise from scale degrees 1 to 4 and back down, while the soprano is set in parallel thirds from scale degrees 3 through 6. This time the interpolating scale degree 1 occurs on the offbeats of the upper part. Although the interpolated offbeats are not technically on scale degree 5, this texture is nearly identical to that of the previous section, and so forms a connection based on the same pattern of realization. During the 1750s, in addition to teaching via keyboard sonatas, Haydn also had the occasion to compose his first set of string quartets, Opus 1 and Opus 2, commissioned for a famous musical gathering at the castle of Baron Fürnberg. In this example from the first movement of Opus 1 No. 4 in G major, we see a similar texture in the second key of the exposition, D major. Beginning in measure 25, Haydn uses the parallel thirds pattern between the cello and the second violin, the cello taking scale degrees 1, 2, 1, 7, and 1, and the second violin taking scale degrees 3, 4, 3, 2, and 3. As before, this pattern is ornamented with interpolated scale degree 5s in the second violin on the offbeats. This pattern repeats twice more, with the cello and viola alternately assuming the bass counterpoint. There are countless similar passages in these early works, all of which point to possible oral instruction in diminution that Haydn may have received from Porpora. Each pattern that appears in these examples comes directly from Partimento, which Haydn realized each time with appropriate voice leading and surface texture. In addition to Durante's diminutions, Porpora's own compositions from the 1750s provide further clues as to the connection between Partimento practice and composition. While in Vienna, Porpora was commissioned to write a set of 12 duo sonatas for violin, bass, and continuo from the Duchess Maria Antonia of Bavaria. Composed in 1754, it is quite possible that Haydn knew of these works, or even witnessed parts of their composition while apprenticing with Porpora. These works utilize characteristic passages taken from Partimento, and incorporate textures and melodic lines that would come to influence Haydn's own approach to composition in his early works. Porpora's 9th sonata from this set opens with a bass tonic pedal, and a soprano that first arpeggiates melodically from scale degree 3 to scale degree 5, then uses a neighbor note motion from scale degree 6 to 5, implying a 4 chord with a 6/4 above it, falling back to the tonic 5/3 chord. This eventually moves into what Robert Yergin has labeled as a printer, a scalar passage in the bass descending from scale degrees 4, 3, 2, and 1, with scale degrees 6, 5, 4, and 3 in the soprano. This leads into a half cadence on B in measure 5. Haydn, in the slow second movement of his Sonata in C, Hoboken 16 No. 1, uses many of the same voice-leading features. Although simpler than Porpora's work in texture, Haydn's sonata likewise begins with a soprano arpeggiation over a bass tonic pedal, leading to an upper neighbor figure with scale degrees 6 and 5. Also, like Porpora's sonata, Haydn's 6-5 counterpoint is set to a 4 chord with a 6/4 above it, falling back to a tonic 5/3. This opening then moves directly into a printer with scale degrees 4, 3, 2, and 1 in the bass, and 6, 5, 4, and 3 above it in the soprano. Noteworthy in this printer is the variant Haydn uses with scale degree 5 interpolated between scale degrees 2 and 1 in the bass, creating the added cadential effect of an imperfect authentic cadence to close out the first theme. Returning to Porpora's Opus 12 number 9, the second key of the exposition contains another voice-leading schema taken from Partimento practice, what Jürgen has termed the Fenaroli. Beginning in measure 12, this pattern is canonic, with scale degrees 7, 1, 2, and 3 first appearing in the soprano, and then set in imitative counterpoint in the bass. The second movement of Haydn's Sonata in C, Hoboken 16, number 3, is an adagio in G major. Upon modulation to the second key, D major, Haydn similarly uses a Fenaroli. Beginning in the bass in measure 20, the line of scale degrees 7, 1, 2, 3, 7, 1 appears, imitated by the soprano in measure 21, with scale degrees 3, 7, 1, 2, and 3, creating a similar effect. By way of a final example, the third movement of Porpora's Sonata Opus 12 number 2 contains a striking chromatic passage on a quasi-dominant pedal point, embellished with chromatic voice leading. After a modulation to the exposition's second key, the passage in question begins at measure 15. Here, a chromatic inner voice first highlights a motion between G sharp and A, twice, before moving on to descend through G natural, F sharp, F natural, and E, the latter two pitches harmonized with a G sharp diminished seventh chord moving to the dominant A before alternating between tonic and dominant harmonies in the new key. Haydn's Sonata in G, Hoboken 16, number 6, has a similar passage, also occurring after a modulation to the second key. Beginning at the end of measure 10, a true dominant pedal point begins and outlines the same chromatic descent from an upper A to G sharp, G natural, F sharp, F natural, and E. As in the previous Porpora sonata, Haydn's penultimate chord under the F natural is harmonized by a G sharp diminished seventh chord, resolving to the E in the soprano over an A dominant triad. The voicing of Haydn's sonata highlights the chromatic line in the upper voice. Porpora's sonatas represent an older style of the generation of Corelli, while Haydn's pieces are both more modern and simultaneously less complex. The fact that the keyboard sonatas in particular were composed for amateur students perhaps adds to the need for a simpler texture. In spite of the differences in complexity, the presence of the same voice-leading patterns in the music of both Porpora and Haydn from the exact same period indicates a common structural outline that Porpora certainly obtained from Partimento, and Haydn very possibly obtained from Porpora. Haydn's Il Maestro e lo Scolare was composed in 1766, just 2 years before his maestro Porpora died. It is tempting to view that work as a kind of homage to Porpora, at whose side the Scolare Haydn would workshop the various patterns discussed above for 3 years. While previous attempts to pinpoint the exact influence Porpora may have had on Haydn's music have been inconclusive, recent and quickly developing knowledge surrounding Italian methods on Partimento treatises perhaps reveals aspects of Haydn's training during these early years. Haydn's mastery of the Italian style helped in part to advance his career, as he quickly became an in-demand composer whose growing network of connections eventually secured him his lifelong occupation as Kapellmeister at the court of Esterhazy. Although Haydn never specifically mentions having completed Partimento exercises, the very DNA of Porpora's musical background and the nature of their interaction together strongly imply that Haydn indeed was introduced to these methods and incorporated them into his earliest compositions. Using Partimento methods and schema theory, a renewed focus on Haydn's true fundamentals comment may lead to further insights to Haydn's music throughout his career. Thank you.